At the age of 21, Robert Shipp was given life in prison for selling crack. He is held responsible for the total amount moved in a distribution ring for which he was the night shift supervisor. David Mosby was given 40 years in prison for his first ever criminal offense of conspiring to distribute methamphetamines, which he was selling to fund his own addiction. Stories like these are not unique, and they're not the exception, they're standard. In both of these cases, the men convicted were guilty and being charged by the law that was fair, but their sentences were not. The United States' current drug policy needs to reflect a better balance between punishment and rehabilitation. Our policy does not deter drug use. It fails to treat addiction as the mental illness that it is, and it requires extreme sentencing for non-violent criminals. When President Nixon declared the war on drugs nearly 40 years ago, the intention was to eliminate drug use through the use of harsher consequences. Since then, the U.S. has implemented policies such as the habitual offender law, also known as the Three Strikes Law, which requires a mandatory sentence of 25 years to life for any third felony committed, regardless of whether it was nonviolent, such as minor amounts of drug possession. While many believe that current mandatory minimum sentences are necessary for deterring crime, it is these sentences that have resulted in the U.S. acquiring the highest incarceration rate in the world, with over 2 million people in prisons and over 4 million on probation or parole. And despite all of our aggressive measures in sentencing and policies, the U.S. remains the leading country in drug abuse, with drug use only increasing, therefore rendering our policy as an ineffective and necessary depletion on our resources. A recent poll has reported that 2/3 of Americans would rather see drug offenders rehabilitated rather than incarcerated. But despite this growing realization among most Americans, our prison system remains painfully lacking in the pivotal recognition that drug addiction is a mental illness, and it's one that can and should be treated. But due to the U.S.'s zero tolerance policy, punishment is often prioritized over rehabilitation, and consequently, our prisons and rehabilitation centers are underfunded and incredibly ill-equipped to accommodate our mentally ill prisoners. Evidence from the CRC Health Group has shown that both the availability of drugs in prison and the strain of being incarcerated not only increases addiction among prisoners, but it actually encourages its initial development. The inadequacy of drug treatment in our prison system is best iterated by Stephen Downing, a retired deputy chief of the LAPD, who states that the person you see on the park bench with the collapsed veins does not need a police officer or a judge or a prison guard. What that person needs is a physician and a psychologist. Nonviolent drug offenders are criminals, and when you think criminal, you think violence. And while the prevailing concern is that any drug offense, no matter how minor, will only lead to more violent crime, research already existed back in 1971 that showed that drug users are less likely to be incarcerated for assault and murder than non-drug users. In fact, only 16% of federally incarcerated drug offenders actually use a weapon in connection with their crime. Imprisoning non-violent drug offenders only agitates the problem, placing them in an environment that fosters and even requires aggression and violence. It also limits career options upon release, now being labeled as a criminal, which is associated with violence. Many employers find this unappealing and can easily lead these convicts to resort to a life of crime, further perpetuating the cycle. It is our moral duty to provide treatment to those in need of it. Pope John Paul II stated that not to promote the interests of prisoners would be to make imprisonment a mere act of vengeance on the part of the society. It is enough to enforce sentencing reform simply because it is how we can best serve our citizens and encourage them to pursue the highest version of themselves. Non-violent drug offenders are constantly being given longer sentences than those accused of robbery, murder, and rape. And rather than treating their illness, we are throwing them in prison, empowering their addiction and weakening their resolve to fight it. We must implement policies such as the Smarter Sentencing Act, which would cut mandatory minimum sentences in half while allowing judges to use their discretion when sentencing lower-level defendants. While this bill is unlikely to pass, the billions of dollars that it would save the U.S. can be used to fund rehab programs within and out of prisons. It can also be used to research the possibility of addiction screening, which can predict a person's susceptibility to addiction prior to exposure. It is imperative that we stop placing a Band-Aid on an issue that requires a more permanent and effective solution than our drug policy. In order to best protect and care for our citizens, we must find a way to integrate reasonable punitive measures with rehabilitation, because without it, drug use will only continue to prevail, our citizens' illnesses will continue to be ignored, and nonviolent criminals will continue to be unfairly sentenced. Drug offenders do not need to learn that breaking the law is bad. They need to learn how to choose not to do it. Thank you very much.